Richard Westbrook wore stolen jewelry to his own charity gala, and the only person who recognized it was the waitress he'd humiliated an hour earlier. The cameo brooch pinned to his $8,000 blazer had been ripped from an innocent woman's home 70 years ago, part of a theft so calculated, so cruel, that it destroyed 3 generations of a family who never stood a chance against money that could rewrite history. And now Claire Mitchell stood 3 feet away, her hands shaking around a tray of lobster canapes, staring at the one piece of evidence that could either vindicate her dying grandmother or destroy what was left of Claire's life. A single object can be a doorway to a past that 3 generations tried to bury. A cameo brooch, no bigger than a silver dollar, can hold secrets that powerful families built empires to conceal. Claire had learned this truth the hard way, standing in the Harborview Country Club with a tray of appetizers trembling in her hands, staring at something that shattered every law of possibility she understood. For Claire, the world had narrowed to a brutal mathematics of survival. At 28, she juggled double shifts at Newport's most exclusive country club, her fingers perpetually wrinkled from dishwater, her feet screaming inside bargain non-slip shoes that promised comfort but delivered blisters. The medical bills arrived like clockwork, $3,000 per day for her grandmother's ICU bed, where machines beeped their expensive rhythm and kept Dorothy Mitchell tethered to a life measured in crumpled dollar bills and desperate tips for men who barely saw her face. Claire counted every 5, calculating medication costs against grocery budgets, choosing between her own student loan payments and her grandmother's oxygen supply. The panic lived in her chest now, a creature with teeth, reminding her that she was always one disaster away from losing everything that mattered. Richard Westbrook represented a different species of human being entirely. At 62, the real estate magnate had accumulated a fortune north of $400 million, a number so abstract it became meaningless, except in the way it insulated him from every consequence ordinary people faced. His reputation preceded him like a cold front, caustic, cruel, a man who sent back perfectly cooked steaks just to watch servers squirm, who treated staff like furniture that occasionally required correction. Even his fellow billionaires found excuses to avoid him at charity galas. He wielded power through small cruelties, measuring his dominance in the trembling hands of waitresses and the apologetic stammering of managers who knew his membership dues alone paid 3 salaries. The country club staff drew straws for his table. Today, Claire had drawn the short one. This wasn't a redemption story where kindness melted an icy heart and everyone learned valuable lessons about humanity. This was something darker, messier truer. This was how an antique cameo brooch, Victorian era, hand-carved from shell, worth anywhere from $2,000 to $150,000, depending on provenance, exposed a theft that spanned 70 years and destroyed the carefully constructed legend of New England's most respected family. The September afternoon painted the Harborview Country Club in golden light that money couldn't buy, but certainly knew how to frame. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased Newport Harbor like a museum exhibit, sailboats scattered across blue water, their white sails brilliant against the sky, old money on display in its natural habitat. Inside, the air carried the scent of leather-bound menus and aged bourbon, the faint ghost of cigar smoke that lingered despite regulations, as if wealth itself perfumed the atmosphere. Crystal clinked against china in conversations conducted at the volume of secrets. The room arranged itself in visible hierarchy, senators and CEOs near the windows, doctors and lawyers in the middle distance, and service workers like Claire hovering at the edges, visible only when needed, invisible the moment the need passed. This wasn't a fairy tale where goodness triumphed and justice arrived wearing crown. Real life wore a faded black uniform and carried a tray of overpriced appetizers. Truth arrived with aching feet and a question that would unravel everything. The truth doesn't wait for you to be ready. Sometimes it appears on a Tuesday afternoon when you're bone-tired and broke, pinned to a billionaire's lapel, daring you to see what everyone else missed. Subscribe now, because stories like this don't make the evening news. They happen in the invisible spaces where ordinary people face impossible choices, and only here will you discover what happens when someone finally says enough. The brooch commanded attention in the way only true craftsmanship could. Oval in shape, roughly the diameter of a silver dollar, it caught the September light filtering through the club's windows and threw it back in layers of impossible beauty. The cameo itself depicted a woman's profile carved in delicate ivory relief, her features rendered with a kind of precision that marked Victorian-era artistry. A straight Roman nose, not the turned-up button style of modern pieces, with hair swept back in intricate waves that suggested individual strands rather than generic curls. The background blazed carnelian red, that deep rust-orange color that came from genuine shell carved down through its natural layers. Around the edge, seed pearls formed a perfect border, each one no bigger than a pinhead, frozen teardrops of luminescence that had survived more than a century without losing their luster. The gold setting embraced the cameo like living vines, leaves and tendrils worked in such delicate filigree that they seemed to grow rather than simply decorate. But it was the back that mattered most, the part Richard Westbrook couldn't see as the brooch caught light on his blazer. 3 letters engraved in a careful hand, worn smooth by time and desperate fingers. M.E.R. Claire knew those letters the way she knew her own name. She had traced them 1,000 times, sitting beside her grandmother's hospital bed during the long nights when Dorothy Mitchell drifted between consciousness and morphine dreams. The identical brooch, and it was identical, not similar, not close, but impossibly, undeniably the same, lived in a safe deposit box 3 miles away, locked behind institutional doors and security protocols that measured value in dollars rather than generations of grief. Dorothy clutched a photograph of it even now, her arthritic fingers bent around the laminated image like it was the last solid thing in a world gone liquid with pain and medication. In her half-sleep, she whispered the same words over and over. Justice. They took everything. Stolen memories. The brooch represented more than jewelry, more than the estimated $75,000 to $150,000 it might fetch at auction if provenance could be established. It was proof of identity, of heritage, of a family line that stretched back to Margaret Eleanor Ross, Claire's great-great-grandmother, who had carried that brooch from Ireland in 1919 with nothing else but hope and a dream of survival in America. The M.E.R. engraving stood for Margaret Eleanor Ross, a woman who died believing herself accused of theft, who spent her final months in poverty and shame because someone with money and power had decided her truth didn't matter. For 3 generations, the Mitchell family had lived under that shadow. The brooch was supposed to be proof they came from somewhere, that they mattered, that their ancestors had value beyond what the rich decided to grant them. And now that proof sat pinned to a billionaire's blazer like a trophy. Claire had been running on autopilot, the way every service worker learned to survive double shifts and demanding customers. Smile, nod, deliver appetizers, fade into the background, collect tips, repeat. Her feet ached in the cheap non-slip shoes. Her lower back sent up flares of protest from hours of carrying trays, and her mind had retreated to that numb place where she calculated bills and prayed for slow leaks rather than catastrophic floods. Then Richard Westbrook adjusted his blazer, a casual gesture of privilege, and sunlight caught the cameo brooch pinned to his lapel. Time performed that trick it does in moments of crisis. It stretched and warped, giving Claire's brain space to process the impossible while her body continued its forward momentum toward his table. The world narrowed to that single object. The ivory profile, the carnelian background, the seed pearl border, the gold vines. Her hands began to shake before her conscious mind fully understood what she was seeing. The appetizer tray tilted dangerously, lobster canapes sliding toward disaster as her grip faltered. Cold sweat broke across her shoulders and down her spine. Her heart kicked into a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with recognition that shattered the laws of possibility. Tunnel vision closed in from the edges, darkening the expensive room until only the brooch remained in sharp focus. The impossibility crashed over her like a physical wave. The words came out before Claire's better judgment could stop them. Her voice shook, barely above a whisper, but in the hushed atmosphere of the country club it carried like a shout. "Excuse me, sir. My grandmother has a brooch exactly like yours." Richard Westbrook froze mid-reach for his water glass, his hand suspended in air as if time itself had paused to consider what came next. The transformation that crossed his face happened in stages. First, casual dismissal, the expression of a man interrupted by irrelevant staff. Then sharp attention as her words penetrated. Finally, something darker and more calculated, the look of a predator assessing a potential threat. The pause stretched long enough that conversations at nearby tables faltered and died. Other club members sensed the shift in atmosphere, that electric charge that precedes confrontation. When Richard finally spoke, his voice came out ice-cold, each word delivered with the precision of a verdict rather than an opinion. That's impossible. Not maybe, not unlikely, not are you sure. Impossible. The single word carried the weight of absolute declaration, the kind of certainty that came from a lifetime of never being questioned, never being wrong, never having to explain himself to people who wore uniforms and served his meals. The surrounding tables went quiet, silverware suspended, wine glasses paused mid-sip. Everyone within earshot understood they were witnessing something that didn't belong in this carefully controlled environment, the collision of two worlds that were supposed to remain forever separate. Richard's eyes narrowed, and he performed a visual assessment of Claire that reduced her to inventory. Faded black uniform, with a small stain near the hem that she tried to scrub out, bargain shoes worn thin at the heels, tired eyes with shadows underneath that spoke of too many double shifts and not enough sleep. His hand made a dismissive gesture toward her appearance, not quite pointing, but conveying judgment nonetheless. When he spoke again, his tone carried the particular cruelty of class warfare, delivered in a single sentence. Where would someone like your grandmother acquire such a piece? The emphasis on someone like did the heavy lifting, turning the question into an accusation, a reminder of hierarchy, a statement about who belonged in the world of valuable objects, and who existed merely to serve those who did. Shame flooded Claire's chest, hot and familiar, that old learned response to being reminded of her place, of her worth measured in hourly wages and crumpled tips. But underneath the shame, something harder and more certain pushed back. She knew what she'd seen. She knew those MER letters existed on the back of that brooch. She knew her grandmother's truth, even if the world had spent 70 years trying to bury it. If you've ever been dismissed because of where you work or how much money you make, if someone has ever looked at your uniform instead of your face, drop a like right now. This story gets deeper than you can imagine, and what happens next will prove that truth doesn't care about tax brackets. Stay with me. Richard settled back in his chair with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling narratives. His brooch, he explained in the tone one might use with a confused child, was absolutely one of a kind, a documented family heirloom with provenance that stretched back generations. His grandfather had purchased it in 1952 from an estate sale, he said, the belongings of an aristocratic European family fallen on hard times after the war. The story came out smooth and practiced, each detail designed to establish legitimacy. There were papers, he assured her, certificates of authentication, documentation that tracked the brooch's history through distinguished hands. The original owner had been a countess or possibly a duchess, someone with a title, and therefore unquestionable claim to valuable objects. The cameo itself had been identified by experts as Victorian era, carved from genuine shell by master craftsmen in the 1880s, worth a considerable sum even then and priceless now, as both art and artifact. He delivered each piece of information with patronizing certainty, constructing a wall of credentials and documentation that rendered Claire's claim not just wrong, but ridiculous. Her grandmother's version, he made clear without quite saying it directly, was impossible not because the objects didn't match, but because people like her grandmother didn't possess objects like his brooch. The logic was circular and absolute. The brooch was valuable. Valuable things belonged to wealthy families. Therefore, her grandmother's claim must be false. Richard leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a more intimate register, the kind reserved for delivering wounds meant to stick. Your grandmother is either confused, lying, or in possession of a clever fake. He paused between each option, giving Claire time to absorb the insult layered within the words. Each possibility was chosen to wound, Confusion suggested dementia, the cruel dismissal of an elderly woman's mind as unreliable. Lying attacked character, impugned honor, suggested moral failure passed down through generations. A clever fake implied poverty-driven delusion, the pathetic attempt of working-class people to claim connection to quality they could never afford. The attack wasn't just on Dorothy Mitchell, but on Claire herself, on their entire family line, on the very possibility that their truth could exist alongside his wealth. Around them, other country club members watched with the careful attention people give to social hierarchies being reinforced. Some faces showed sympathy, others agreement, most simply fascination at drama unfolding in a space designed to prevent exactly this kind of confrontation. Richard's eyes never left Claire's face, watching her reaction, measuring whether she would accept her place or continue pushing against boundaries meant to keep people like her in service positions rather than equality. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a money clip, 18-karat gold, probably worth more than Claire made in a month. He peeled off $300 bills with deliberate slowness, each movement designed to emphasize the ease with which he handled amounts that would change her week. The bills landed on the white tablecloth one at a time, crisp and new, the kind of money that came from bank withdrawals rather than crumpled tips. "For your trouble," he said, his tone making clear the words meant something entirely different. "And for discretion." The second phrase carried weight. This wasn't payment for service, but the price of her silence, a transaction that reduced her truth to something that could be purchased and dismissed. It was an insult delivered via wealth, putting a dollar amount on her dignity, her grandmother's honor, her family's history. He stood to leave, adjusting his cufflinks with a kind of attention to detail that men with custom suits learned early. At full height, he towered over Claire's seated customers, his posture broadcasting ownership not just of the club, but of the very space he occupied. Physical dominance radiated from him, tall, broad-shouldered, imposing in the way that combined genetic fortune with a lifetime of entitlement. Claire looked at the $300 bills lying on the table. They represented groceries, a student loan payment, part of her grandmother's medication costs, practical money that would ease the constant pressure she lived under. Her hand moved toward them, muscle memory trained by years of accepting tips, of knowing her place, of understanding that survival sometimes meant swallowing pride. Then her fingers diverted, moving past the money to the unused napkin beside it. She wiped her hands carefully, stood, and met Richard's eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both. "Then prove it." Her voice came out stronger than she'd expected, steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "My grandmother has hers. I'm going to find out which one is real." The room went silent, that particular quality of quiet that follows a boundary being crossed. Richard Westbrook stopped mid-turn, his hand frozen on the back of his chair. He turned slowly, reassessing her with new attention, his expression shifting from dismissal to something more complex. Calculation mixed with what might have been grudging respect. The visual contrast between them told its own story. Richard wore a Brioni suit that cost more than Claire's car, custom-tailored to his frame and fabric that whispered quality with every movement. His Patek Philippe watch caught light the same way his brooch did, announcing wealth in quiet symbols that other wealthy people recognized instantly. Italian leather shoes, probably handmade, probably from a boutique most people couldn't afford to window shop. His posture spoke of private schools and country clubs, generations of assuming ownership of every space he entered. Claire's uniform told a different story, purchased from a restaurant supply company, faded from industrial washing, a small stain near the hem that wouldn't come out no matter how many times she scrubbed it. Her shoes came from a discount chain, marketed as comfortable but delivering blisters, worn thin at the heels from too many double shifts. Her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't cover medical bills. Between them stretched an invisible curtain of authority, that barrier of class and wealth that separated people into categories of who mattered and who served. In any other context, this confrontation would have been impossible. Predator and prey didn't negotiate. Sharks didn't debate with fish. But something had shifted. The prey had bared teeth. Have you ever stood up to someone powerful when everyone told you to back down? when logic and survival instincts screamed that you should accept your place and move on. Comment below, because Claire's about to risk everything she has left. Richard stood still for a long moment, studying Claire with a kind of attention he probably reserved for business negotiations and property acquisitions. Then, to everyone's surprise including his own, he sat back down. The movement happened in stages, deliberate rather than defeated, a man making a choice rather than accepting a demand. He pulled a business card from his wallet, heavy cardstock, embossed lettering, the kind that announced importance before you even read the name. Monday, 10 a.m. My attorney's office, he said, his voice stripped of its earlier cruelty, now cold and professional. He placed the card on the table, pushing it past the $100 bills still lying there like abandoned insults. Bring your grandmother's brooch. We'll settle this. The words carried the weight of a challenge accepted, a gauntlet picked up, a recognition that whatever came next would happen on terms neither of them fully controlled. Dorothy Mitchell had been drifting in and out of consciousness for days, the morphine pulling her under in waves that carried her away from pain, but also from clarity. Then, on Saturday morning, something shifted. Claire arrived for her daily visit to find her grandmother's eyes clear and focused, tracking movement in the room with a sharpness that had been absent since the stroke. Dorothy's hand reached out, trembling but deliberate, gripping Claire's wrist with surprising strength. "You found it," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse but certain in its meaning. Claire didn't ask how her grandmother knew. Perhaps she talked in her sleep, or perhaps Dorothy simply understood her granddaughter well enough to read the truth in her face. The story that followed came out in pieces, interrupted by coughing and sips of water. But Dorothy pushed through with the determination of someone who'd been waiting 70 years to tell this truth to someone who might finally believe her. Her mother Rose had received the brooch from her mother Margaret, passed down in a moment of immigration that split a family across an ocean. Margaret Eleanor Ross had been born in County Cork in 1883, educated beyond what most girls of her station could hope for, speaking 3 languages and reading poetry in the original French. She'd come to Boston in 1919 at age 36, fleeing a marriage that had ended in violence, and seeking the new world's promise of reinvention. The brooch had been her mother's gift, one of a matched set created for mother and daughter, the only valuable objects their family possessed after generations of tenant farming under British landlords. In Boston, Margaret found work as a lady's maid for the Westbrook family, who owned a mansion in Beacon Hill and commanded respect that came from old shipping fortunes and newer real estate investments. She was brilliant, Dorothy said with fierce pride, could organize a household budget better than the mistress herself, spoke elegantly enough to confuse guests about her station. But the Westbrooks treated her with a casual cruelty that wealthy people reserved for servants who reminded them too much of their own intelligence, their own capacity for dignity. Margaret endured it for 35 years, sending money back to Ireland, raising her daughter Rose alone after her husband died young, keeping that cameo brooch as the one proof that she came from people who valued beauty and permanence. The accusation came in 1955, when Margaret was 72 years old and had given 3.5 decades of her life to the Westbrook family. Mrs. Westbrook claimed that several pieces of jewelry had gone missing from her bedroom safe, a diamond bracelet, a ruby ring, a pearl necklace, items worth thousands of dollars even then. The police were called immediately, and Margaret's small room in the servants' quarters was searched with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for criminals rather than employees. They found nothing at first, then miraculously discovered the pearl necklace tucked in the back of Margaret's dresser drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief that Margaret swore she'd never seen before. The police continued their search, and in the chaos that followed, officers moving furniture, dumping drawers, treating her few possessions like evidence of moral failure, Margaret's cameo brooch disappeared. She reported it missing immediately, said it had been in her jewelry box on the dresser, her most valuable possession, and the one thing she would never risk losing. The police dismissed her complaint with the logic that guilty people often employ misdirection. Her protest that she'd been framed, that the necklace had been planted, that her brooch had been stolen fell on ears that heard only the desperation of someone caught. The Westbrook family, showing what they called mercy, declined to press criminal charges in light of her age and years of service. Instead, they simply fired her without references, leaving her unemployable at 72 with no savings and nowhere to go. Margaret died 6 months later in a charity ward, her body giving up after her spirit had been broken. On her deathbed, she'd gripped Rose's hand and whispered the words that Dorothy would repeat to Claire 70 years later. They took everything, even proof of who we are. The family had spent 7 decades believing the brooch was lost forever, stolen by police or Westbrooks during that chaotic search. Just another casualty of the cruelty that poor people endured at the hands of those with power to rewrite history. The medical bills had reached $186,000 and continued climbing at a rate that Claire tracked with the precision of someone watching a debt grow faster than any human could run. Dorothy's insurance covered some costs, but the gap between coverage and reality created a chasm that swallowed Claire's paycheck, her savings, and her hope for any future that didn't involve crushing debt. Claire's own student loans added another $42,000 to the calculation. Loans taken out for a degree she'd never finished because her grandmother got sick and someone needed to work full-time. The house that Dorothy had owned for 40 years, paid off with money earned cleaning other people's homes, now carried a second mortgage taken out to cover earlier medical crises. Foreclosure loomed 60 days away, another clock ticking down to the moment when everything Margaret had worked for, everything Rose had preserved, everything Dorothy had maintained would be stripped away by institutions that measured worth in bank balances rather than generations of dignity. If the brooch was authentic, if Claire could prove it belonged to her family, if she could establish provenance and value, it was worth somewhere between $75,000 and $150,000 according to preliminary estimates from antique dealers she'd called from the country club bathroom. That money could erase medical debt, save the house, give Claire space to breathe for the first time in years. But the money was almost secondary to what really mattered. Dorothy was dying, believing her mother had been a thief, that the cloud of suspicion that had followed their family for 3 generations was deserved. Claire's entire life had been shaped by poverty that stemmed from Margaret's firing. No references meant Rose couldn't find good work, which meant Dorothy grew up poor, which meant Claire grew up poor, a cascade of consequences from one false accusation. The brooch represented vindication, proof that Margaret had been innocent, evidence that the Westbrook family had stolen not just an object, but 3 generations of opportunity. Dorothy's voice broke when she described her grandmother Margaret, tears cutting tracks down her weathered face. She was kind, Dorothy said, her hands twisting the hospital blanket. She was honest. She was a devout Catholic who went to Mass every morning before work, who never spoke ill of anyone, who raised my mother alone with dignity that poverty couldn't touch. The morphine made her words come slower, but the emotion behind them was sharp and clear. She never stole anything in her life. Not food when we were hungry, not coins left carelessly on dressers, not even respect that was owed to her. Dorothy's eyes closed, and for a moment Claire thought she'd drifted off again, but then she continued in a whisper that carried more weight than shouting. They didn't just take the brooch. They took her dignity. They took her name. They took her life. She died believing the world thought she was a thief. Then Dorothy opened her eyes and looked directly at Claire with sudden fierce clarity. "Let it go," she said, her grip tightening on Claire's hand. "Some doors are best left closed. The Westbrooks have money and power and lawyers. They'll destroy you the same way they destroyed her." Fear lived in her grandmother's eyes, the kind that came from watching wealth crush truth over and over across a lifetime. If family honor means more to you than safety, if you understand that some battles have to be fought even when the odds guarantee pain, then you understand the choice Claire faced. Subscribe so you don't miss how this David versus Goliath battle ends. Because what happens next will restore your faith that truth can still matter in a world built to protect the powerful. The law offices of Brennan and Associates occupied the 47th floor of a glass tower in downtown Boston's financial district, the kind of building that seemed designed to intimidate before you even entered. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Boston Harbor in a view that probably cost more per square foot than Claire's entire apartment. Patricia Brennan met them in a conference room where the furniture spoke quietly of money, leather chairs that whispered when you moved, a table made from a single slab of wood that might have been older than the building itself. She was sharp in every sense: sharp suit, sharp eyes, sharp voice that cut through pleasantries to get straight to business. Claire brought her grandmother's brooch in the same velvet box it had lived in for decades, the fabric worn thin from Dorothy's desperate fingers. Richard arrived with his brooch in a museum-quality case, the kind with climate control and UV protection, the kind that announced value before you even saw what it protected. Patricia placed both brooches under a magnifying lamp on the conference table, the light harsh and revealing, making it impossible to miss any detail or difference. The brooches sat side by side under the light, and the impossibility of what they represented became even more stark. They were absolutely identical, not similar, not close, but matching in every dimension and detail, as if they'd been created at the same moment by the same hand using the same materials. The oval shape measured precisely 1.8 inches tall and 1.4 inches wide on both pieces. The ivory relief showed the same woman's profile, the same Roman nose indicating Victorian-era craftsmanship, the same waves of hair carved with individual strand detail. The carnelian background blazed the same deep rust orange, that color that came from genuine shell carved through natural layers. The seed pearl borders contained the same number of pearls. Claire counted them, 34 on each piece, arranged in identical patterns. The gold settings showed the same intricate leaf and vine patterns, down to the smallest tendril. Both brooches displayed similar age-appropriate wear, tiny scratches on the gold, slight dulling on the pearls, the kind of patina that came from a century and a half of existence, rather than artificial aging. The MER engravings on the back were identical in size, style, and placement, the letters worn smooth from fingers that had traced them seeking comfort or memory. Patricia called in Thomas Ashford, a jeweler with 40 years of experience authenticating antique pieces for estate sales and insurance purposes. He examined both brooches with loops and lights, checking for signs of modern fabrication, testing the materials, measuring dimensions with tools that provided decimal point precision. His assessment came slowly, delivered with the caution of someone who understood his reputation rode on every word. Both authentic Victorian era, I'd say circa 1880, based on the carving style and materials. He paused, frowning at the pieces with genuine confusion. Both show high-quality professional craftsmanship, genuine shell cameo, real gold settings, natural pearls. Then he said the words that changed everything. In 40 years of examining antique jewelry, I've never seen two pieces this identical. This level of matching it shouldn't be possible unless they were deliberately created as a pair. Richard's face underwent a transformation that Claire watched in real time. Confusion replacing the certainty that had defined him. Questions replacing the answers he'd built his family story on. His grandfather had told him the brooch was one of a kind, a unique treasure from European aristocracy, proof of his family's connection to old-world refinement. If both brooches were real, if they'd been created as a match set, then his family story was a lie built on something darker. Patricia Brennan suggested they pause before taking legal action, that an investigation might serve everyone's interests better than a courtroom battle that would expose questions neither family wanted to answer publicly. Then Richard did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He looked at Claire directly and said, "I need to know the truth." Not his family's version or her family's version, but the truth that existed independent of what anyone wanted it to be. He offered resources, access to the Westbrook family archives that had been sealed in storage for decades, a private investigator with skills that went beyond what ordinary people could afford, connections to historians and experts who owed him favors. Claire listened with suspicion that came from a lifetime of learning that wealthy people didn't offer help without expecting something in return. But the brooch sat on the table between them, undeniable proof that something impossible had occurred, and solving that impossibility required resources she didn't have. "Our quest for truth is now inextricably linked," Patricia said, her voice carrying the formal tone of someone making it official. The Boston Public Library's archives smelled like old paper and preservation chemicals, that distinctive scent of history stored in climate-controlled rooms away from light and careless hands. The 1955 police report existed in microfilm records that took 2 hours to locate and another hour to scan through. But when they found it, Margaret Eleanor Ross's name appeared in black and white, official and damning. Theft accusation, Westbrook Estate, suspect. Household staff member Margaret Ross. The newspaper article from the Boston Globe ran 3 days later under the headline, Maid Accused of Theft, with Margaret's name printed for the entire city to see. Her reputation destroyed in 12-point font that couldn't be taken back. The article described her as longtime servant and noted the Westbrook family's mercy in declining to press charges. Immigration records from Ellis Island provided different information, the kind that came from government documents rather than family stories. Margaret Ross, age 36, arrived in New York Harbor on April 12, 1919, aboard the SS Celtic from Liverpool. The customs declaration listed her possessions: 1 trunk of clothing, $47 in cash, and 1-piece jewelry, cameo brooch, personal inheritance. The declaration was signed by the customs officer, who'd inspected her belongings and confirmed their value as below the threshold requiring duty payment. But the most damning discovery came from estate sale records stored in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives. Richard's grandfather, Harrison Westbrook, purchased an antique cameo brooch, Victorian era, in 1955, according to a receipt from Blackstone Estate Sales. The date was October 15, 1955, exactly 3 weeks after the police search of Margaret Ross's room, exactly 2 weeks after she'd been fired without references. Dr. Eleanor Fitzpatrick specialized in Victorian jewelry history with a focus on Irish craftsmen who'd worked in Dublin during the late 19th century. She examined photographs of both brooches, studied the MER engravings, and disappeared into archives that most people didn't know existed. 3 days later, she returned with documents from Dublin's Jewelry Guild records, carefully preserved in the National Archives of Ireland. Maurice Edward Riley had operated a workshop in Dublin from 1875 to 1890, gaining reputation for cameo work that combined Italian techniques with Irish sensibilities. He was known specifically for creating paired sets for wealthy clients, matching pieces intended for mothers and daughters, sisters, close friends. The tradition came from Italian cameo makers who believed that identical pieces shared spiritual connection across distance. Dr. Fitzpatrick found the specific commission in Riley's order books, preserved in handwriting that had survived nearly 150 years. 2 cameo brooches, identical design, carnelian shell, gold setting, seed pearl border. Commissioned by Mrs. Margaret Ross. Payment received June 1880. Delivered August 1880. The order noted that 1 piece was for Mrs. Ross herself, the other for her daughter, who would receive it upon her marriage or emigration, whichever came first. The pieces fell into place with the terrible clarity of a puzzle you wish you hadn't solved. Margaret's mother had commissioned the matching set in Dublin in 1880, keeping 1 brooch and giving the other to Margaret when she left Ireland in 1919. The mother's brooch remained in Ireland, passed down through whatever family line existed there, eventually finding its way through estate sales and migrations that records couldn't fully track. But that didn't explain how Richard's grandfather obtained one of them in 1955, the same year Margaret was accused of theft, unless the answer was darker than anyone wanted to admit. The trail went cold when they tried to trace the other branch of the family tree. Irish records from that era were incomplete, scattered across parishes and counties with gaps that wars and poverty had created. They knew 2 identical brooches had been created, knew Margaret brought 1 to America, but the question that mattered most remained unanswered. Which brooch did Richard's grandfather really acquire, and what had he done to get it? Patricia Brennan's helpfulness took on a different quality in the days that followed, the kind of assistance that came too quickly and ended too conveniently. She volunteered to search the Westbrook family archives personally, claiming her long association with the family gave her access and knowledge that would accelerate their investigation. She disappeared into the storage facility for 3 days, then returned to the conference room with a carefully composed expression of disappointment. No relevant documents existed, she reported, just routine business records, society pages, photographs that showed nothing incriminating. The archives had been thoroughly cataloged decades ago, she assured them, and anything relating to household staff from the 1950s had been disposed of according to standard document retention policies. But Richard's cousin Edward Westbrook contacted Claire directly 2 days later, calling her personal phone in a way that suggested he'd been searching for ways to reach her outside official channels. Edward had always suspected his grandfather Harrison of crimes that went deeper than family legend admitted, had spent years collecting whispers and inconsistencies that no one wanted to examine too closely. He offered access to something Patricia didn't know existed, a locked attic in the original family estate on Newport's Bellevue Avenue. Rooms sealed after Harrison's death in 1978 and forgotten by everyone except Edward, who'd inherited the deteriorating mansion and its secrets. Edward's voice carried urgency when he explained that Patricia was hiding something, that she wasn't just a family attorney, but Richard's sister-in-law, married to Richard's brother Thomas, positioned to benefit enormously if the Westbrook fortune and reputation remained intact. If the truth came out, if Harrison's crimes became public, the lawsuits and restitution demands would drain millions from trusts and foundations that currently funded Patricia's lifestyle. The attic smelled like secrets left to rot, dust and old paper, and something darker underneath, the atmospheric weight of truth buried for generations. Edward led them up narrow stairs that servants would have used, into rooms where trunks and boxes had been stacked and forgotten when the family moved to more modern estates. Harrison Westbrook's personal papers filled 3 steamer trunks marked with his initials, documents his widow had ordered sealed rather than destroyed, perhaps unable to completely erase evidence, even as she protected his memory. The diary sat in the bottom of the second trunk, leather-bound and locked, the key taped to the inside cover, as if Harrison had wanted it found eventually, wanted someone to know the truth even if he couldn't confess it himself. Richard's hands shook as he opened it, and what they read there rewrote 70 years of family history in Harrison's own handwriting. He hadn't just purchased a brooch in 1955. He'd orchestrated an entire theft designed to cover his own crimes. The diary detailed it with the kind of attention to detail that suggested pride rather than shame. He'd been assisting the police investigation into the stolen Westbrook jewelry, his social position giving him authority to search the servants' quarters, to handle evidence, to be present during every moment of Margaret Ross's humiliation. But Margaret had possessed something he wanted, something he'd noticed during his visits to the family home when his parents still owned it, 2 cameo brooches, Victorian-era masterpieces that she kept in a small jewelry box in her room. She had both, her own brooch brought from Ireland and her mother's brooch sent from Dublin after her mother's death in 1952, finally reunited after decades of separation. Harrison had wanted them, had convinced himself that valuable objects belonged in wealthy hands rather than wasted on servants who couldn't appreciate their worth. So he'd planted the stolen pearl necklace in Margaret's room, had called the police with anonymous tips, had positioned himself to help with the search. During the chaos that followed, police tearing apart Margaret's small room, other servants watching in horror, Margaret herself barely coherent with shock, Harrison had pocketed both brooches. He kept one for himself, the family heirloom he would claim to have purchased from a European estate sale, documentation he would forge with the help of a corrupt antiquities dealer he'd known from his time in Boston's art scene. The other brooch he sold immediately to a private collector for $8,000, a sum worth 10 times that in today's money, profit from his perfectly executed theft. Margaret was innocent, completely and absolutely innocent. But Harrison's plan had worked perfectly, because who would believe a servant over a Westbrook? Who would question the word of a man whose family built libraries and funded hospitals? She died believing she was suspected of theft, never knowing that the man who'd smiled politely at her for 35 years had destroyed her life for 2 pieces of jewelry. Patricia had discovered the diary 8 years earlier during her first inventory of the estate after Edward mentioned possibly donating the mansion to a historical society. She'd recognized immediately what it meant. Evidence of a crime that would unravel the Westbrook family's carefully constructed reputation. Proof that their fortune was built partially on theft and cruelty. If the truth emerged, the lawsuits would be catastrophic. Margaret's descendants could sue for restitution, emotional damages, the value of the brooches plus interest compounded over 70 years. Historical societies and journalists would dissect every Westbrook transaction, looking for other crimes, other victims. The family foundation that bore the Westbrook name would collapse under the weight of scandal. taking with it Patricia's position, her income, her social standing. So she'd hidden the diary, had sealed the attic with better locks, had paid Edward's property taxes to keep him from selling the estate before she could properly clean it of incriminating evidence. She'd been tracking Claire and Richard's investigation from the beginning, had hired a private security firm to follow them, monitor their communications, report on every archive they visited and every expert they consulted. Her plan was already in motion: destroy the diary, discredit Claire as a con artist targeting a wealthy family, have Richard declared mentally unfit, and place his assets under conservatorship controlled by family members who understood the importance of protecting the Westbrook name. The evidence would disappear, and with it, any hope of justice for Margaret Eleanor Ross. What would you do if you discovered your whole family legacy was built on lies? If everything you believed about your name and your history turned out to be carefully constructed fiction covering up theft and cruelty? The next 5 minutes will shock you in ways you can't imagine. Don't click away now, because what happens next proves that truth will fight back even when the powerful try to bury it. Claire's phone buzzed with a text from Edward. Patricia knows. Saw her car outside the estate. She's coming for the diary. They had maybe 12 hours before evidence disappeared forever, before lawyers and money rewrote reality the way it had been rewritten in 1955. Richard made the decision in seconds. They would go public before Patricia could destroy what they'd found, would expose the truth in a setting so public and documented that even Westbrook money couldn't make it disappear. The Westbrook Foundation's 50th anniversary gala was scheduled for Saturday night. 300 guests, including Boston's social elite, business leaders, politicians who valued the Westbrook name, and media covering what should have been a celebration of philanthropy. The event would be live-streamed, recorded from multiple angles, attended by reporters who would love nothing more than a scandal involving one of New England's most respected families. They would walk in with the diary, with documents, with proof, and they would tell the truth before Patricia could stop them. The Boston Harbor Hotel ballroom had been transformed into a temple of wealth and carefully curated history. Crystal chandeliers cast light that seemed designed to make jewelry sparkle and designer gowns shimmer, creating an atmosphere where money felt like oxygen, essential and everywhere. The Westbrook Foundation's 50th anniversary celebration drew Boston's elite the way gravity draws objects. Senators and CEOs, old money and new, society matriarchs and their carefully groomed heirs. Everyone who mattered in New England's carefully maintained hierarchy of influence. Live stream cameras positioned strategically around the room would broadcast the event to donors who couldn't attend, creating a permanent record of what should have been an evening of speeches and self-congratulation. Patricia Brennan hosted with the confidence of someone who believed she controlled every variable, who had planned this event down to the minute and knew exactly how the narrative would unfold. She wore authority like her designer dress, moving through the crowd with the assurance of someone who had never been challenged successfully. Then Richard and Claire arrived with Edward, walking through the ballroom doors like uninvited truth, crashing a celebration built on lies. Richard carried a leather briefcase that contained photocopies of Harrison's diary, documents from the attic, proof that couldn't be denied even by people who desperately wanted to look away. Richard took the microphone during Patricia's prepared speech about the foundation's charitable work, a moment of transition when attention was focused and cameras were recording. His voice came out steady despite the trembling in his hands, carried by speakers that ensured every person in the ballroom heard every word. "I need to tell you the truth about my family," he began, and the room went silent with the particular quality of attention that comes when people sense something important breaking. He pressed a button on a remote, and the screens positioned around the ballroom, meant to display foundation achievements and grateful recipients, instead showed pages from Harrison Westbrook's diary, enlarged so the handwriting filled 10-foot screens in unmistakable clarity. The confession of theft, the detailed planning of how he'd frame an innocent woman, the calculation of profit from stolen brooches. Margaret Eleanor Ross's name appeared over and over, sometimes with contempt, sometimes with casual dismissal, always with the certainty that her truth didn't matter because she was merely a servant. Richard's voice grew stronger as he read passages aloud, his grandfather's words condemning the Westbrook legacy more powerfully than any outside accusation could. He explained the investigation, the matched brooches, the immigration records that proved Margaret had brought her brooch legally to America, the Dublin craftsman records that confirmed two identical pieces had been created for Margaret's family. The crowd reacted in stages, first shock at the interruption, then confusion at the accusations, finally gasping comprehension as the evidence accumulated on screens around them. Camera flashes created strobing light as journalists recognized the story unfolding in front of them. Society scandal and historical injustice combined in a narrative too compelling to ignore. Patricia moved fast, her legal training providing scripts for crisis management even as her world collapsed. She claimed the documents were fabrications, that Richard was experiencing a mental health crisis, that Claire had manipulated him with forged evidence designed to extort money from a vulnerable man. Her voice carried practiced authority, the tone of someone accustomed to being believed because of credentials and position. She gestured to security, instructed them to escort Richard out of the ballroom, to end this disruption before it contaminated the foundation's reputation further. Two security guards moved toward Richard and Claire with the reluctance of people caught between competing authorities. Then Claire pulled out her phone and pressed play on a recording she'd made 3 days earlier when Patricia hadn't known Edward had given them access to the attic. Patricia's voice filled the ballroom through the sound system, clear and undeniable, caught in a phone call with someone she'd hired to destroy evidence. The diary needs to disappear completely. I don't care what it costs. If they have copies, discredit them. Say Richard is unstable, that the girl is a con artist. Make sure nothing traces back to the family. Patricia's own words condemned her, proof of conspiracy to obstruct justice, to protect criminals even 70 years after their crimes. The crowd turned against her with the swift judgment that social hierarchies render when someone violates unwritten codes. She'd lied to them, had attempted to manipulate them into celebrating a family built on theft. The security guard stepped away from Richard and moved toward Patricia instead, responding to the shift in power that rippled through the room. The ballroom doors opened and Claire's grandmother was wheeled in on a hospital transport chair, arranged secretly by Edward, who understood that justice required a victim's voice. Dorothy Mitchell was 93 years old, on portable oxygen, her body diminished by time and illness, but her eyes burning with purpose that 7 decades hadn't extinguished. Edward guided the wheelchair to the microphone, and Dorothy gripped the armrests, pulling herself forward with determination that silenced the murmuring crowd. Her voice shook but carried clearly, amplified by technology that ensured everyone heard, everyone bore witness. "Your grandfather didn't just steal jewelry," she said, her words falling like stones into still water. "He stole my mother's life. He stole her dignity. He stole her good name." Tears cut tracks down her weathered face, but she continued with the strength of someone who'd waited 70 years for this moment. She died believing she was suspected of being a thief. She died in poverty because your family took everything from her. And this foundation celebrates the money he built on her destruction. The silence that followed was absolute, broken finally by a single person standing and beginning to clap. Then another stood and another, until the entire ballroom rose in a standing ovation that acknowledged Dorothy's courage and validated Margaret's innocence across 7 decades of injustice. Actual police arrived within minutes, called by journalists who recognized obstruction of justice when they heard it recorded. They escorted Patricia from the ballroom not as honored attorney, but as someone facing serious questions about evidence tampering and conspiracy. Richard stood at the microphone with tears on his face and made the only choice that honor allowed. He apologized publicly to Dorothy and Claire, acknowledged his family's crimes without qualification or excuse, pledged $2 million in immediate restitution to Margaret's descendants. He announced the creation of the Margaret Eleanor Ross Scholarship for descendants of domestic workers seeking education, established with a $10 million endowment that would carry her name forward in justice rather than shame. The media captured everything: the confession, the apology, the evidence displayed on screens, Dorothy's testimony, Patricia's removal. By midnight, the story was trending nationally. Proof that even old money couldn't bury truth when ordinary people refused to stay silent. Dorothy Mitchell's medical bills were paid in full, every itemized charge from ICU to medication erased by money that should have come 70 years earlier. She'd been moved to one of Boston's finest care facilities, the kind where nurses had time to know residents' names and preferences, where therapy happened in gardens overlooking the harbor rather than institutional hallways. She was thriving in ways that medicine alone couldn't explain, sustained by the knowledge that her mother had been vindicated, that Margaret's name had been cleared publicly and permanently. Claire enrolled in college for the first time without juggling 3 jobs simultaneously, studying criminal justice with the kind of focus that comes from understanding exactly why the system needs people who care about truth more than convenience. Dorothy's house was saved from foreclosure, the second mortgage paid off, repairs made that restored it to the home that 3 generations had known. Both cameo brooches were professionally preserved in museum-quality cases, displayed side by side in the Margaret Eleanor Ross exhibit at the Boston Historical Society, their matching beauty now proof of innocence rather than evidence of impossible coincidence. Visitors read the plaques that told Margaret's story, learned about the Irish immigrant who'd been framed by the family she served, understood that history was full of forgotten names that deserved remembering. Richard Westbrook resigned from his real estate company, stepped away from business dealings that had consumed his life, transformed in ways that crisis sometimes allows. He devoted himself to running the foundation he'd renamed the Margaret Ross Justice Foundation, an organization now focused on investigating historical wrongs committed against working families who never had resources to fight back. The foundation hired researchers and attorneys, partnered with universities and historical societies, pursued cases where wealthy families had destroyed lives through theft, fraud, or simple cruelty enabled by class privilege. Claire became the foundation's first director of victim advocacy, her experience giving her insight into how power operates and how ordinary people can challenge systems designed to protect the privileged. The partnership that had formed in a country club confrontation became something neither of them expected. A working relationship built on shared commitment to justice. 2 people from opposite worlds discovering common purpose. Richard's money and connections, combined with Claire's determination and understanding of how working families navigate systems stacked against them, created something powerful. Together, they were rewriting the rules, proving that wealth could be redirected toward repair rather than accumulation, that truth mattered more than reputation. The ceremony at Margaret's grave happened on a Saturday morning, when spring was turning Boston green again. Her headstone had been replaced with one that told the truth in letters carved deep into granite. Margaret Eleanor Ross, innocent, vindicated, remembered, 1883 to 1956. Both cameo brooches were temporarily placed on the grave for the memorial service, reunited at last not in theft, but in justice, symbols of a family's resilience across generations. Dorothy placed flowers, Irish roses that Margaret had loved, and whispered words that were part prayer, part promise that the family would never forget what had been sacrificed and finally restored. Claire stood beside her grandmother, hand on her shoulder, understanding that 3 generations of pain were healing in this moment of public acknowledgement. The weight that had pressed on their family since 1955, the shadow of suspicion and shame, lifted like fog burned away by sunlight. Margaret could finally rest, her name cleared, her truth told, her descendants vindicated. Truth doesn't care about money or time or the power that tries to bury it. Justice delayed is not justice denied if someone is brave enough to fight, to stand up when logic says to sit down, to speak when silence would be easier. One person's courage can rewrite history, can restore names that powerful people tried to erase, can prove that ordinary people matter just as much as those who inherit wealth and privilege. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Subscribe for more stories of ordinary people who refused to be silenced, who fought against impossible odds and proved that truth still matters. Share this with someone who needs to know that justice can still find its way even when the powerful try to block the path. Comment below. What family story are you fighting to tell? What truth has been buried that deserves to be heard? Remember this always. Your voice matters, your family matters, and justice is always worth fighting for, even when the cost is everything you have.